Well, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure, great honor to be here at a very important conference and gathering. And as was pointed out by Dr. Afua Cooper and by Her Excellency Michael Jean, it's really an exciting time in Halifax with this symposium taking place, and specifically as well the Black People's Summit, which I think will be an exciting occasion. So this is the first panel of the day, and it's basically on an incredibly important subject. I know we talked about the lack of an apology, and we're talking about what Dr. Cooper's referred to as the great secret in Canadian history. So I'm going to provide sort of like a preamble to sort of put this in context, sort of in terms of the discussion that will take place as our distinguished panelists here will expand on. On December 23rd, 2013, as some of you know, the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed 2015 to 2024 the International Decade for People of African Descent. Okay? This decade builds on and amplifies previous UN initiatives regarding slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. For example, on December 17th, the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed March 25th as the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Central to this decade is the recognition of the ongoing legacy and impact of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and colonialism. Direct provenance lies with the historic 2001 UN Conference on Racism, which I recommend people to actually do research on. It was a major international event, unfortunately marginalized by the changes in geopolitics that took place just a little while afterwards, which was 9/11. But the conference declared, quote, that slavery and the slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade, were appalling tragedies in the history of humanity, that slavery and the slave trade are a crime against humanity and should always have been so, especially the transatlantic slave trade, and among the major sources and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other related intolerance, and that Africans and people of African descent were victims of these acts and continue to be victims of their consequences, end of quote. The November 18, 2014 United Nations Program on Activities for the Implementation of the International Decade for People of African Descent echoed that stance, quote, and I quote, that people of African descent were victims of slavery, the slave trade, and colonialism, and continue to be victims of their consequences, end of quote. Scholars have discussed and debated the relationship between the transatlantic slave trade and the modern world, especially the emergence and consolidation of capitalism as a world system and the intersections and articulations between racism and that system of capitalism. Trevor Getz argues that it is more accurate to speak of the transatlantic slave system rather than the conventional transatlantic slave trade. While the centrality of the transatlantic slave trade as a reference framework is indisputable, the boundaries of slavery as an international institution, mode of production, and social practice exceeded the prosaic connotations of the commercial nexus. Trevor Getz again underscores the imperative to, quote, emphasize the systemic reach of transatlantic slaving, which extended well beyond commerce, end of quote. During the span of the transatlantic slave system, the Atlantic Ocean became the superhighway for the transfer of millions of kidnapped Africans. Those who survived the crossing built, quote-unquote, new cultures and, quote-unquote, a new world, creating wealth for Europe and European-derived nations. Western wealth and power are anchored in a racialized labor force. These historical processes were therefore the precursors and the foundation of today's global distribution of wealth and power, the global inequality and inequities that we deal with. But what of Canada? And specifically, what of Nova Scotia and the Maritimes? Where do they fit into the transatlantic slave system? Quite often, slavery is presented as having occurred completely outside of Canada. Dr. Afua Cooper has shown in her seminal and groundbreaking work on Canadian slavery, The Hanging of Angelique, The Untold Story of Slavery in Canada and the Burning of Old Montreal, that slavery was institutionalized in Canadian society for well over 2 centuries. She says, and I quote, slavery is Canada's best kept secret, locked within the national closet, and because it is a secret, it is written out of official history. But slavery was an institutionalized practice for over 200 years. Contrary to popular belief, slavery was common in Canada, end of quote. Dr. Cooper also notes that, quote, people of African descent, free and enslaved, have vanished from national narratives. It is possible to complete a graduate degree in Canadian studies and not know that slavery existed in Canada, end of quote. Perhaps when one thinks of that lack of an apology to people of African descent in this country, it doesn't seem as surprising when we have this tremendous erasure of the black presence. Dr. Harvey Whitfield and he will be speaking later on in a panel here, notes in his Black Slavery in the Maritimes, a history in documents, quote, "The introduction and developments of slavery in the New World is among the most important events in global history, resulting in the growth of a lucrative and exploitative labor system justified by perceived racial differences. Slavery existed throughout the New World, from Chile and Argentina in the south to Nova Scotia in the north. It is not surprising that slavery played a part in Canadian history, but it is startling that it has not received widespread attention from the general Canadian public and historians alike. The marginalization," this is end of quote, "the marginalization of blacks in Canada has its historical roots in the institution of slavery. While the institution of slavery in Canada never acquired the quantitative dimensions it had in the United States or elsewhere in the Americas, its influence and impact exceeded its actual scale and economic weight, shaping how persons of African descent were perceived and treated in this country. A constellation of social practices, conventions, ideas, and worldviews emerged from slavery which would shape the trajectories of black communities long after slavery was abolished in this country." And today we have a distinguished panel to actually explore and elaborate and really look at how slavery is such a critical moment in Canadian history and why, in a sense, we must continue to understand how it's continued to shape Canada. So we have, who deserves no introduction, but I will, Dr. Afua Cooper, who is a multidisciplinary scholar and activist. She's a fellow at the Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. She, as you know, is a pioneering scholar and researcher in Black Canadian history and a leading expert in Canadian slavery studies. She's also chaired the scholarly panel that investigated Dalhousie University's connection to slavery and anti-blackness, and she also leads the research efforts and was the principal author of the subsequent report, Lord Dalhousie: History on Slavery and Race. These initiatives reveal the connections between the university and the Atlantic slaving systems. Dr. Cooper is the principal investigator for the $1 million Department of Canadian Heritage funded a Black People's History of Canada project housed at Dalhousie University. At this school, she teaches Black Studies courses and holds a Killam Research Chair. Additionally, Dr. Cooper is a member of the International Scientific Committee for the Roots of Enslaved Peoples, UNESCO, part of UNESCO, United Nations Education and Scientific Cultural Organization, which just hosted a major conference here a few weeks ago. And she was recently honored by Maclean's magazine as one of the 50 most influential Canadians. Dr. Cooper has published 13 books, which ranges across diverse topics and genres. She's a celebrated poet, and in 2020, she was awarded the Portia White Prize, Nova Scotia's highest recognition for the arts. She's also the winner of the J.M. Abram Atlantic Poetry Award for her book, Black Matters. And she will be presenting her title, Situating Canada, as part of the Atlantic history of slavery. Okay? We also have with us as well Natasha Henry Dixon, and she is a historian and educator. You know, she's president of the Ontario Historical Society. She has recently taken a teaching position at York University in African Canadian history. July the 1st, 2022, I think was the official time you took up that position. She has published books on emancipation. She is a leading contributor in curriculum and so on. And as I said, she has extensive experience in African Canadian history and has won several awards for her publications and curriculum development. And as I said before, she will now be making pioneering contributions to York University. And last but not least, we have Dr. Catherine Cotreau-Robbins, who is the Senior Curator of Archaeology for the Nova Scotia Museum and the Department of Communities and Culture, Tourism and Heritage. Her work as an archaeologist and curator connects with the full range of cultural time periods in the Maritimes, with particular emphasis on African, Nova Scotian, and Mi'kmaq archaeological knowledge. Her graduate degrees focused on the arrival of the enslaved in Nova Scotia following the American Revolution. This interdisciplinary scholarship was instrumental in forging connections with the African Nova Scotian community that continue today and have inspired many publications, exhibits, and new paths in relationships towards building education and developing the collective archaeological record. She currently holds an adjunct professor positions at St. Mary's University in anthropology and in graduate studies history at Dalhousie University. In 2019, she received the Minister's Award for Excellence for her work in community collaboration and archaeology in Nova Scotia, and she'll be presenting on slavery and archaeology. And I forgot to mention that Natasha Henry will be presenting on plant the seeds and they will blossom, pedagogies rooted in integrated Black history and STEM. So that's been a mouthful. I'm sure we're all excited to hear our panel to talk about a very important period. Each panelist will have 20 minutes.
Who goes first?
And will be Dr. Cooper, followed by Professor Henry, followed by Dr. Kutru Robbins, right? Okay? And they each have 20 minutes, and I'm sure there'll be ample time for questions, because this is an incredibly provocative and rich part of Canadian history that has been ignored. Dr. Cooper, you have the floor.
My talk is going to be on rethinking Canadian slavery, the West India slave trade. So oftentimes when we think of slavery in Canada, it's like slavery within Canada as this discrete situation, which it was and it wasn't. When we conceptualize Canada, when we think of slavery as part of the Atlantic system, then we can add another dimension to this study, to this topic. And so what's the West India trade? And I'll just get into the paper because, we have a short time, so I'll just read from my paper. And I look at Halifax's merchants and the West India trade. The motto of Halifax is Emari Merces, which is Latin for from the sea wealth. And it makes sense, right? The Maritimes is known for its fishing resources, its maritime resources, and from the sea comes the wealth of the city and the wealth of the colony. And over the course of Halifax's and Nova Scotia's colonial history, this has been true. Emari Merces. The wealth from the sea, mainly of fish and other marine life, has undergirded the province's economy. Nowhere was this truer than in Nova Scotia's participation in the triangular and plantation trades that came to define the Atlantic world. The colony was part of the British Empire, and before that, the French Empire, and was connected to other imperial holdings in the Western Atlantic and Europe through war, trade, migration, and politics. And this was made evident in this trading structure called the West India trade. The West India trade from around 1780 to 1840 was Nova Scotia's most important commercial activity and the main source of provincial wealth. All throughout the maritime region, there were numerous ports, custom houses, and lighthouses that had to pay each province a tax for its maritime businesses. From the very beginning in 1749, from its very beginning, the city of Halifax, which was founded in 1749, had been established as an important port for West Indian commerce. In fact, the West Indies was the main market for Nova Scotia's goods. The West India trade was premised upon the economic arrangement in which colonial businessmen exported salted fish, salted pork and beef, wheat flour, horses, timber, nails, staves, even cattle, and other building products to the West Indies. The salted fish and meat formed the main protein sources for enslaved Caribbean people. So the West Indies and the term Caribbean, I'll use them interchangeably, it's the same place. The West Indian planters exchanged these goods for slave-produced rum, sugar, molasses, cocoa, coffee, and other tropical items. So what did the West Indian merchants, who were slave owners, most of them, sent up the coast to Nova Scotia, New England, and other places, were these items produced by enslaved people. Historian Eric Kimball notes with respect to New England merchants that the products they exported to the Caribbean built the infrastructure of slavery there. So think of that, same is true for Nova Scotia's businessmen. The fish and meats that they sent down provided the main protein source for the enslaved people. And also the timber. We often don't think of timber when we think of the commerce between the West Indies and the Caribbean. But timber from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were very important to that trade. The slaveholders in the West Indies used timber to build houses, to and other form of structures. So talking about the products from here being used to build and support the infrastructure of slavery in the Caribbean. Halifax's merchants accumulated a lot of private wealth from this trade and used their capital accumulation to engage in diverse and related activities such as shipbuilding, banking, insurance, warehousing, infrastructural and educational development, and other endeavors. In this way, they imported the West Indian plantation to Nova Scotia and colonial Canada as a whole. And my colleague, Dr. Shirley Tillotson, she uses phrase about importing the plantation to West Indies, to Nova Scotia. Though there were enslaved Africans in Nova Scotia under both colonial regimes, the vast majority of the people in the province were white who were engaged in small-scale production. Most of them had never seen a Caribbean sugar work or a sugar mill, yet they consumed slave-grown products and benefited directly and indirectly from the proceeds of Caribbean slavery. Especially through provincial taxation on imported slave-grown goods. These taxes provided an important source of colonial revenue. In many ways, their livelihoods were linked to Caribbean slavery and, by extension, the African slave trade. In the 1820s, imperial officials, abolitionists, and others sought to ameliorate slavery. Pro-slavery activists, including many in Nova Scotia, saw this as signaling the end of slavery and therefore an attack on their livelihood. In other words, in the 1820s, when there was this agitation across the Atlantic world to end slavery, many merchants and businessmen and intellectuals within Nova Scotia thought that to end slavery, this whole idea was a bad thing, and slavery should continue, West Indian slavery should continue because they benefited from it. In 1826, the editor of the Acadian Recorder, which was a local Nova Scotian newspaper, sounding the alarm, sums up the significance of the West India trade to Nova Scotia's economy and society. And this is what he said. The fish, the lumber, and so on that we send here from Nova Scotia form the bulk of our export trade. It is the trade that employs an immense number of industrial men, directly and indirectly. On its success has Halifax, in great measure, depended for her existence, and the agricultural part of the province, their imports and circulating medium. The revenue arising from this branch of business are also the principal fund from which we have been enabled to undertake and complete many public works of great usefulness and even of relative grandeur, beside its chief means of supporting the civilist chargeable on the province. This profitable commerce has hitherto given substance to our fishermen. It has supplied the merchant with a mode of employing his capital and skill to advantage, and has diffused through every channel of business a life and vigor which could not have existed without its aid. These are very strong words. He's saying the West India trade, this commerce, the sending down of dried fish and meats to the West Indies, and the bringing up of rum, molasses, and sugar, which was used, some of it locally, but also a lot of it re-exported to New England, to Europe, and to the Mediterranean. Without this branch of commerce, he said the province would not be success. It would not be successful at all. And so many people depends on it. The fishermen, the civilists, the taxes that are got from the when the ships are coming in, they have to pay an incoming tax. They have to pay a tax on the goods that they are bringing in, and how this tax is used to build up the infrastructure of the province. Businessmen use it to build grand homes, and like I said earlier, to reinvest in other endeavors. So this editor is saying, look, if slavery is abolished, it's gonna hurt the province, West Indian slavery, it's gonna hurt the province in very crucial ways. So this information, this is the crux of the West India trade. It's the nexus that connected Halifax and the Caribbean, and this nexus was slavery. This nexus was the slave trade. Now, I've said here that Halifax was the principal port, the most important colonial port, but there were other ports participated in this trade: Lunenburg, Pictou, Liverpool, Yarmouth, Shelburne, even smaller ports like Port Greville and Parsborough. We don't think of those ports as, of major importance when it came to the West India trade, but indeed they were. I know at Port Greville, for example, it was an important site of shipbuilding. The folks there built ships that plied the coastal trade between the West Indies and between the West Indies and Nova Scotia. Now, if we look at this ad, and this is very, very early, by Joshua Major. It's a famous ad. I'm sure some of you have seen it. And Joshua Major was an important colonial businessman, very wealthy, originally came from the Channel Islands, was a kind of kingmaker in Nova Scotia. He wasn't a politician per se, but he used his wealth to get people in power that he wanted to get in power because he knew they would work for him. And he was also a shipbuilder and a ship owner, and a very influential West India merchant. He wasn't from the West Indies. We say West India merchant because this was the name given to these colonial merchants, these merchants who got the bulk of their wealth from this Caribbean trade. Now, in 1752, he advertises in a local newspaper, the Halifax Gazette, and he said, just imported and to be sold at Major Loopman's store in Halifax, several Negro slaves, namely a very lightly Negro wench of about 35 years of age, Creole born, meaning she's born in the colony, has been brought up in a gentleman's family and capable of doing all sorts of work belonging thereto. Needlework, in the best manner, washing, ironing, cookery, and every other thing that can be expected from such a slave. This is 1752, and Joshua Major is selling these people at an auction right here in Halifax, and he has children, he has a man that he's also selling, and we know he brought up these people from the West Indies. So when you think of the rum and the sugar and the molasses that are coming up in these ships to the maritime colonies, human beings were also brought up. Enslaved people were also brought up alongside the sugar and the molasses and the coffee and the cocoa and so forth. And here's an image of Cronan's Wharf, because back in the day, in those times, colonial businessmen many of them had their businesses right down by the harbor there, Halifax's waterfront. Here's an image of Cronan's Wharf. And I want you to look at the barrels that are right there in sort of the background there. And when we think of barrels, we think of, they're these quotidian sort of instruments, containers. We see them every day. We don't pay them much attention. But they were tremendously important in the West India trade. They're made from the timber. the staves. And they are packed with the dried fish, the dried cod, the herring, the meats, and so on, and sealed, put in the ships, which sail down to the West Indies, and they're taken off and used by the merchants there or by the planters. But it was these barrels and caskets that are also used in which the sugar and the molasses and the rum and so on. People talk about a hogshead of sugar. It's a measurement, the hogshead, used to determine how much sugar is going to be going into these barrels. So these barrels, they're kind of boring, quotidian, as I said, but very useful, very, very useful containers or instruments within the West India trade. So here there are these barrels on Cronan's Wharf. We can imagine that they're packed with dry cod or salted beef or what have you. They're going to go down to the West Indies, or they could have just arrived up in Halifax, up in Nova Scotia from Antigua, and it could be sugar that are in these barrels. As here's a painting which is titled Shipping Sugar. Again, there are the barrels filled with sugar, could be molasses that are being rolled onto the boat, and then on the ship they're waiting in the background, which is probably coming up to Halifax or maybe to Yarmouth. Let me, so you can see from your slide there that with the abolition of British West Indian slavery in 1838, Nova Scotian merchants began importing the bulk of their sugar products and rum from the French and slave colonies and from Brazil. So, because we were tied together in the British imperial world, trading with the British West Indies was sort of a natural fit. But when slavery ended, the merchants here went to other slave colonies to get their slave-grown products. So you can see how tremendously important the labor that enslaved Africans performed in the West Indies, how important that labor was to the economy up here in Nova Scotia. The merchants played a very important role. One of them, Enos Collins, who was a West Indian merchant, was reputed to be the richest man in British North America with a net worth of $6 million when he died. I just want to underscore that the vessels that were coming in, as I've said before, had to pay a tax inbound from the West Indies, and so many of the custom duties were funneled back into infrastructural development in this province. Dalhousie University itself, the original endowment for this university came from the West India trade, came from the Castine Fund, the money which, the Nova Scotian and British military seized from Castine, Maine, and so much of that money was provided by the West India trade. Dalhousie University also got more monies from the Nova Scotia legislature from the tax fund, and that tax fund was money that was also got from the West India trade. We know, for example, that one important West India merchant, Mather Biles Allman, who was a governor of Dalhousie University, a merchant, a banker, and a politician, used the money or reinvested some of his West India trade money to establish the Bank of Nova Scotia, one of Canada's big 5 banks. We know, for example, that 13 of the 17 merchants that chartered the Bank of Nova Scotia in February 1832 were West India merchants. So they reinvested the capital that they gained from this arm of the slave trade into banking, into shipping, into mining, into insurance, and into other activities. This is I want you all to think about that. And I'm going to end with this, the Sankofa bird, how important it is for us to go back, to look back to the past, and to remember the past as we move forward. Because it's only in remembering. When we think today, nobody really cares about the West Indies. People from the West Indies have a hard time getting a visa to come to Canada. But there was a time when, and not even, there was a time when the West Indies was what provided wealth for these maritime colonies. Canadian banks got their start, at least 3 of the big banks got their start from commercial activities with the West Indies. Thank you very much.
I'll be speaking a little bit about actually my research on slavery in colonial Ontario and the ways that we should think about teaching about the history of slavery in our curriculum. I wanted to start by sharing the 1793 Act to Limit Slavery, which was legislation passed by the Parliament of Upper Canada, July 1793. And what this legislation did was it first and foremost confirmed that the institution of slavery would remain intact, that those who were enslaved would remain enslaved and would maintain the status of being slaves for life. And then it introduced gradual abolition. So those people of African descent who entered the province would be able to be free. And through this introduction and the passage of this legislation, there was a situation where there were those who were at the same time held in bondage, but those who were also beginning to live their lives in freedom. And I'll come back to this. It's a piece of legislation that was just marked in terms of the month of July. It also is very much connected to the celebration of Emancipation Day, which is coming up on August 1st. And so I'll return to this. This legislation was introduced and influenced due to the Chloe Cooley incident that took place earlier that year in March. And Chloe Cooley was an enslaved Black woman who was forcibly bound by her enslaver, Adam Vrooman, and along with the help of a few other men, and was placed in a boat to be sold across the Niagara River into the United States. A Black loyalist by the name of Peter Martin brought word back to Simcoe, John Graves Simcoe, about what happened, and Simcoe and the Attorney General used this incident to introduce this legislation. So Chloe Cooley, an enslaved person who unfortunately did not get to benefit from this legislation, was very influential in influencing this passage of this legislation that would later benefit and provide freedom to other enslaved people. Here you'll see me in front of a plaque that was also actually work led by Dr. Cooper to mark the bicentennial of the end of the slave trade in 2007. And another reason to share this image as well is to get us to think about the ways that the history of enslavement, those who were enslaved, are not enough as part of the public memory of the wider Canadian historical narrative, but that these are also segues into teaching about their lives and their experiences. One of the archival documents that led me to decide to research the history of enslavement of African people in Upper Canada as part of my doctoral research was this bill of sale located at the Archives of Ontario. And this bill of sale, as you'll see, it places a Negro woman and child for sale in 1812. And if you notice, going back to the legislation was passed in 1793. And so here we see the continuity of the sale and exchange of human people in the course of enslavement in the province. This document was something, again, that was pivotal in leading my decision to study about the history of slavery, but also to think more critically about how do we center the work that we are doing, the teaching and the learning, the research around their lives, around their experiences. Who was this woman? Who was this child who were held in bondage, who were traded in this exchange? And so these archival documents are very important in terms of understanding the nature of enslavement, in trying to recoup and recover their lives, their voices as much as possible within those restrictions. And it also, again, leads us, to use these resources to teach in the classroom. These resources, these archival documents as well, give us a way to think about these people as individuals, as women, as men, as children. As was mentioned earlier by Isaac and Dr. Cooper, that the history of slavery in Canada is not part of the wider narrative. It's often relegated to the margins. In relation to the history of the Atlantic, a lot of the research on slavery being done does not acknowledge or recognize the history of slavery and its role in the development of colonial Canada. And so utilizing a lot of these resources that are available in archives, traditional archives in a lot of different provinces, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, some of these earlier colonial settlements do provide an opportunity again to capture some of these stories. And there is some work being done on an ongoing basis and increasingly in order to bring these stories into the public view. One of the recent endeavors was the Heritage Minute that was recently released by Historica Canada to create a visual representation of the history and the experience of Chloe Cooley. Now, of course, you cannot capture the entire history in 1 minute, but what this resource does is it provides a segue, again, an entry point into learning more about this history, into learning more about Chloe Cooley, other enslaved women, and other enslaved people. It's also, when we look at the history of enslavement, there are two angles to which to approach the teaching of slavery. First, as I kind of briefly mentioned here, looking at it as an experience of people of African descent in colonial Canada and centering their lives and their experiences in that. But it is also about learning more about the institution, how it developed, how it evolved, what its particular iteration was in these contexts in Canada, and to better understand what was enacted upon those who were enslaved by the system and by the individuals who were enslavers and engaged in enslaving in different ways. Here is a plaque, which was an anonymous plaque, an installation that was put up in the city of Toronto. It would have been a couple of years ago, where someone put these up to bring awareness to some of the individuals who are often lauded as founders of the province, important people in the city, and their role in personally enslaving Black people. Here, this plaque refers to Peter Russell, who was one of the executive council members of the province. He was an administrator, and he enslaved a family of 4 in Toronto. So this, again, provides another entry point into looking at this history. And again, it's important, yes, we think about the experiences of those who were enslaved and can capture it in terms of a Black experience in Canada, but the history of enslavement is also very much and should be situated within Canadian history, within imperial history, Atlantic history, and British history as well, to name a few. When we look at the role of enslavers, one of the things that I continue to pursue is the role of women enslavers, those who actually were able to acquire slaves as property through inheritance, those who were mistresses of the households, married to men who themselves legally held that Black people as property. One of those such women was Hannah Jarvis, the wife of William Jarvis, the first provincial secretary of Upper Canada. And when the legislation that I opened with, the 1793 Act to limit slavery, was introduced, she wrote in her diary and said that the legislation has, by a piece of chicanery, freed all the Negroes. And so here again, we get a little bit of insight into the reliance of slave labor in colonial households, many of those who were elite. Here, Hannah Jarvis as a mistress of the household, and her husband enslaving these 6 people listed here, how they use enslaved labor to raise their family, to benefit their household, but also how enslaved labor benefited the development of the city as well. So there are many resources, there are some resources and increasingly some resources that have been developed to teach about the history of slavery. And here is one project, Enslaved Africans in Upper Canada, again out of the work of Dr. Cooper to mark the bicentennial of the abolition of the slave trade in 2007. It was a partnership with the Archives of Ontario to develop this traveling and online exhibit. And some curriculum resources, again, to bring this information into the classrooms, to raise that awareness in the classrooms and in the public history as well. I recently worked with artist Camille Hunter and Kamal as part of their art installation that looked at the 18 people who were enslaved by the Babe family along the Detroit River, and developed this curriculum guide, Beyond the Underground Railroad, that again seeks to situate the experiences of these individuals in the teaching and learning of slavery. It's important in approaching slavery as, again, recognizing an experience of those who were enslaved. Something that I've heard more commonly from students, people who were students, now adults, people of African descent, that they often associated a sense of shame related to the history of slavery, the enslavement of their ancestors, often because of the way these stories and these narratives were framed. And so it's important to think about, how do we frame these stories in a way that centers their agency, that centers their voices, that allows us to better understand them as people, as spouses, as daughters, as sisters, as children, as sentient beings. One of the interesting stories that I will be sharing as part of my research is a couple who were enslaved in Upper Canada. The man was named Cornelius or Mink, and the woman was Judah Johnson. They were both enslaved by elite military officers, and they, due to the course of their enslavement and being transplanted in Upper Canada, they became a couple. And they, somehow you can tell through the records that they devised a plan for Mink to petition for his freedom. Judah had obtained her freedom from her enslaver, Sir John Johnson, and she had acquired some land and was receiving some rations as a loyalist. And so they came together and devised a way for him to petition in front of a panel, and then for her to submit a petition on behalf of her husband. And there hasn't been much conversation of putting these two people together as a couple, as people who were working collaboratively in pursuit of freedom. And so the interpretation of these archival documents, how we situate the voices and the experience of the enslaved, are very important. Are they being positioned as objects, as objectified others, or are we situating them as historical actors and people worthy of study? Last night we were at, before I talk about the installation, I also wanted to point out that in taking a better look at slavery, and Isaac talked about the different dimensions of slavery in the Canadian colonies, that when we take a look and better understand enslavement, we can see how it took place in these colonies. We can understand the connections in the Atlantic, as Dr. Cooper talked about, in the West Indian trade, and to understand that Canada was very much implicated in the slave trade and in the enslaving of African people. Last night at the reception in the Idea Building, there's an installation by Sylvia Hamilton that aims to memorialize those who were enslaved in Nova Scotia, the earliest residents, Black inhabitants of the province. And it was really moving to see the names of those individuals who were there. There are so many efforts that can be used as part of the instruction of teaching about those experiences. And so while there was a long way to go, again, there are some of these pieces that I shared with you today to think about how we can and why we need to ensure that the history of those who were enslaved are part of our instruction in Canadian history. This is my project that I'm working on, where it's a multimodal project, One Too Many, the enslavement of African people in Upper Canada. And through this project, I am both creating a database, but also creating biographical narratives of those who were enslaved to situate, again, their lives and their experiences, both in the research, but also in curriculum instruction. And so, I'll leave it there and just make a connection to marking Emancipation Day, that in understanding the history of enslavement, we can then get a better understanding of the ways that freedom was ushered in as a result of the advocacy and the resistance of those who were enslaved throughout the Atlantic world, including here in Canada. And it's important for us to recognize that as we continue to improve their representation in history. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank the symposium organizers for their work to get this together. And I really feel quite honored to be with these panelists here to talk about this subject matter. Isaac, I think I'm at 20 minutes, but I might be 22. But I'll watch for your paper. Ah, thank you. Terrific. So I'm going to come at this subject matter from, to use Natasha's words, a different entry point. And I'm going to talk about archaeology. Can everybody hear me okay?
Maybe,
thank you.
Maybe you could put the mic up a bit more.
Mic up a bit?
Yeah.
I hope I don't break it. How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Better?
Yeah.
Merci. A discussion about archaeology, and I'm going to read from a paper here, is a good fit for the theme of the symposium. Archaeology by nature is interdisciplinary. Stories about people in the past that archaeologists explore only come together when multiple streams of evidence, knowledges, voices, and analyses merge and inform one another. Archaeology is science, technology, history, and culture in a big, tremendously informative and human bowl. After many years, I continue to be excited by the possibilities in my field of expertise, and particularly in the discipline of African Canadian archaeology and the archaeology of the enslaved. So let's begin. To compress the presentation abstract, and I think some folks have seen that, indeed, for a long time, the archaeology of slavery has played an important role in telling the history and collision of enslavement. In the US, pioneers of this fieldwork can be found as early as the 1960s. The work in the US has stimulated decades of research, volumes of analyses, university programs, and many, many public presentations in museums and elsewhere. In Canada, the archaeology of slavery has been much slower to start. Investigations into the largest migrations of enslaved people only began in the 1990s. The funding of fieldwork, academic programs, and long-term research are goals largely waiting to be realized. Nevertheless, archaeologists remain convinced that there is much to be discovered and contributed to Canada's slavery narrative. So I propose 3 questions. What is our best direction? Where can we be most impactful? And how can we challenge the current limited place for this story in Canadian society? Let's build some archaeological context. Archaeology is the study of past peoples based on the objects they left behind and the ways they left their imprint on the world. I first heard this in 1980, and I use this all the time because it just is it. For this work, the archaeological framework is historical archaeology. Historical archaeologists work with the physical remains from the ground, documentary, oral, and geographic records. In North America, historical archaeologists are primarily concerned with the development of culture since the 17th century, the way it compares and contrasts with Old World antecedents and its impact on Indigenous peoples' cultural traditions. There are a number of theoretical frameworks that archaeologists draw upon. The archaeology of the enslaved falls within the theoretical framework of post-processual archaeology. Ian Hodder clarifies, archaeologists want to go beyond their data to make statements about the dynamics of past societies. Using the post-processual framework, the archaeology of the enslaved pulls on concepts that favor multiple interpretations and opportunities to draw from a range of disciplines. There is no rigidity in methodologies or separation of static categories, but rather an interplay of collected evidence to create an inclusive, informed study. Overarching this framework more recently is the concept of entanglement, defined by Durr and Fernandini as a metaphor for the complexities elicited from relations between people and between things and other things. Entanglement is a tremendously useful concept to consider when unpacking how people and things, the 2 central elements of the archaeological past, collide and engage and therefore become entwined in relationships over time. The relationship between humans and things and how that is situated in the colonial context links well to the study of the enslaved. Within this frame, Terence Epperson stresses the need for cross-discipline alliances, but more importantly, genuine community-based alliances that value at the core the research goals and contributions of descendant communities. In this post-colonial frame, deliberating with communities all components of archaeological project planning with opportunities for community to guide and participate is essential. The outcome is a collaborative partnership, furthered beyond superficial inclusion and better research results. The energy behind post-colonialism in archaeology is the community collaboration and a participatory research model where the community takes the lead and defines the research questions, interprets and takes ownership of it in order to address needs and/or solve problems. This democratization of research equals better research, more inclusive and rounded research, respectful research, and the engagement and empowerment of descendant communities. This rethinking of archaeological practice is ongoing and must continue to be implemented. With these concepts in mind, has the archaeology of the African diaspora reached maturity since those early decades? Upon reflection, and in some regards, definitely, particularly in the United States. Yet there is much more to do within that post-colonial frame and in our region. To stress again, key to going forward is participatory, community-driven research, the decolonization of archaeological interpretation, and reconciliation with the descendant communities that have a dedicated interest in the cultural heritage of sites under study. When reflecting on the archaeology of the African diaspora in Nova Scotia, thoughts turn to the unfolding of the Loyalist era in the late 18th century. Looking at the archaeological record to gain an understanding of the African diaspora to maritime Canada and subsequent processes of identity formation has been an important aspect of the research of the enslaved so far. But much more needs to be done, and we look to others for guidance. For example, Teresa Singleton, a pioneer in the field in the US, recognized that one cannot fully understand the European colonial experience in the Americas without understanding that of the African. She presents a description of the archaeology of the African diaspora that, when open to include explorations further north, is applicable in Canada. A theme is that scholars must aim to examine archaeological findings from a wide range of sites and integrate them into the historiography of 18th and 19th century African American or African Canadian life, rather than treating them as isolated vignettes. There is value in viewing archaeological findings through the lens of this broad spectrum approach. It is agreed that within the field of historical archaeology nationally, the focus on African Canadian archaeology sites and associated subject matter has been thin. As a result, considerable challenge remains around building interest in the field. In Nova Scotia, there has been over 30 years of work aimed at improving awareness and interest. Again, upon reflection, it's been difficult to sustain. Nevertheless, much has taken place over the decades. Of course, there isn't time to go through the list of projects, but I think it's important to note that since the 1990s, there have been over 45 archaeology projects in Nova Scotia linked to early Black history and culture, and over 60 recorded archaeological sites. A cultural landscape has been established. There have been numerous public presentations and exhibits here and in the US, conference papers, manuscripts, theses, and publications, a National Film Board production, as well as the establishment of 2 museums. I need a sip of water. Thank you. Trying to keep the momentum going and finding new ways to stimulate interest is a persistent issue. Working with and listening to community is the key, as is linking with archaeological professionals encountering the sites in their cultural resource management work. In recent years, a range of African Nova Scotian heritage and archaeological sites and landscapes have been encountered and recorded. Farmsteads, abandoned cemeteries, and sites of African Nova Scotian and Mi'kmaq intersection are in the provincial database and await further study. A recent spirit of collaboration and community-driven partnership has sparked an exciting model which holds promise to take African Nova Scotian archaeology to the next level. And that's the project I do want to describe today. It concerns the community of Beachville. Beachville is an African Nova Scotian community located to the west of the city of Halifax and established by War of 1812 refugees. In 2013, an archaeological site, an entire home, was excavated and revealed a rich artifact collection and architectural features linked to the early 19th century. The residence was destroyed by fire, with all contents inside, and though burned, much of the material culture was intact. The exact identity of the inhabitants and the specific date of their settlement is not yet confirmed. Archival records for the site suggest a Black refugee connection based on the site's location in close proximity to the Black refugee settlements at Beach Hill and Refugee Hill near Lovett Lake. Following this host excavation was the archaeological survey of additional land next door by archaeologist Robert Shears. The survey organized, The survey was organized with the goal of identifying resources related to habitations of War of 1812 refugees that formed the Beachville community. Another objective was to document any features encountered. Historic mapping, which indicates approximate locations of former dwellings, was used to help guide the reconnaissance. Two additional houses were found, as well as other structural features. And those features are within the boundaries of the lots of Pompey Cooper and Benjamin Roberts, noted on the 1816 Beach Hill Land License Plan and the 1818 Refugee Hill Land License Plan. The excavation at Beachville, an additional survey, as well as now a significant artifact collection, generated a tremendous opportunity to link with the descendant community. A community-centered information night at the Beachville Church, the community visit with the Beachville Refugee Hill sites, exhibit presentation and participation in Beachville Days, African Heritage Month exhibitions, and the Finding Our Roots Symposium were opportunities for sharing and dialogue. Finding Our Roots in particular was a powerful day. The community set the agenda, invited the guests, directed the questions, and provided guidance, and asked that we let them take the time among themselves to determine what they would like archaeologists and researchers to do next. Building on this work, Beachville Community Association members and the Nova Scotia Museum curatorial staff and archaeologists came together in the winter of 2022 to develop an Emancipation Day exhibit. We listened to what the community wanted from the exhibit. We brought the artifact collection from the house site to Beachville so the community could take a day to select the artifacts they wanted for display. Text and labels were reviewed jointly. Community members installed the artifacts in display cases, and an opening was planned. Very enthusiastic opening. Most importantly, this collaboration has stimulated more discussion and planning, and I'm excited to learn what the community wants to do next. My point in describing all of this is that, one of the points is that relationship building takes time. Myself, as a government employee, as a white person wanting to work in Beachville, walking in and saying, I'm the archaeologist and this is what needs to be done is not the path. And so I wanted to unpack this work that's been going on over, I don't know, 5 years, 4 or 5 years at Beachville to illustrate that. When thinking of past decades and the projects that have taken place, there are 4 themes that come to the fore. 1, it is confirmed that there is much more archaeological research to be done. 2, driving that work has to be a post-colonial and interdisciplinary structure. 3, work needs to continue on the period of the enslaved in Canada, particularly in the 18th century, which is long and wide and represents a historical cementing of racism that remains active and impactful. 4, all efforts must be with a broad group of voices working together, which includes empowering descendant communities to lead, inform, and challenge archaeological research. I also want to stress that focus on the geographic and cultural landscape of the enslaved can be especially informative. To visualize individuals and families living and working across the land under the control of others, while at the same time exerting agency and resistance in their daily lives, is important to understand and disseminate. Walking the physical spaces, observing the environments where lives played out, understanding the topography and the conscious arrangement of structures, considering the seasons and the daily demands that unfolded is essential information gathering. Layer onto this the excavation of homes, workspaces, and gardens, and the collection of artifacts and flora and fauna specimens. What emerges is a highly complex and intricate landscape of the past that carries many different meanings. These are landscapes that are cultural products, holding values, meanings, and symbols of those who modified them. Landscapes that are physical, but also iconological and ideological. They are always changing, and when modified and inhabited, they exhibit relationships of power and inequality, conditions of labor, and cultural meaning. So to circle back to the 3 questions, archaeology, the hands-on discovery of the past, has a powerful role in this journey. There is a large and deep toolbox to draw from, and it has been underutilized in the study of slavery in Canada. There is a recovery of meaning that comes from multiple methods and multiple voices. It is accessible if we commit to building the capacity together. What is our best direction in this journey? The best direction is centered on creating awareness and opportunities for education regarding the subject matter of Canada's slavery story. Innovative collaboration in bringing the story forward is a must and requires multiple opportunities for uncovering the physical remains of the past as a group. Access to education and training in archaeology and research opportunities for African Canadians and those desiring a path specializing in the field of archaeology is long, long overdue and an obligation of our academic institutions. The best direction is simply community collaboration. That means archaeologists listening and taking guidance from those most connected to the sites and the landscapes under study. There must be many opportunities for being on site and to excavate together. This approach, physically working through the day side by side and uncovering objects of ancestors, is embedded with powerful possibilities to share and learn and create understanding. This approach aligns with the post-colonial paradigm in play in archaeology across Canada with Indigenous peoples. This is not superficial inclusion. This is not the inclusion of the other in order to validate decisions already made by Euro-Canadians. The best direction is more archaeology. Where can we be most impactful? We can be most impactful by practicing meaningful listening with community, sharing and working in partnership, and supporting individuals of African descent in their search and archaeological pursuits. To be successful, support is required from academic institutions. A program of study centered on the archaeology of the African diaspora is sorely lacking in Canada. This is an area of specialization in archaeology that remains wide open for opportunity and awaits activity. Equally absent is a place for student voices in this subject matter. Finally, how can we challenge the current limited place for the story in Canadian society? We can challenge the current limited place by building and compiling the work, developing the field of experts, supporting the research through community collaboration and academic programs, investigating in a post-colonial approach more sites of the enslaved, and working with community to study and publicly present artifacts and collections. We must share discoveries and stories with a wide audience, create opportunities for meaningful dialogue, and most importantly, make space for Canadians to participate in the discovery of thousands of stories in the country. It cannot be said too much. For the work to be meaningful, holistic, relevant, and impactful, community voices must lead the way. As archaeologists, we hear this repeatedly now, and we must heed the call. We can use existing policies to argue for the shift. We can look at the successes of others and use what is working now. In Nova Scotia, we have the Culture Action Plan, the Lord Dalhousie Report, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Strategies, Emancipation Day legislation, and changing museum and university mandates. Use what is readily at hand to push up against this current limited space for African Canadian archaeology of the enslaved. In this moment of change we are collectively experiencing, let's create new spaces and generate a path together. Through the archaeology work that will take us to the past in a new and inclusive way, we can challenge the anti-Black prejudice that continues to plague our society. Thank you.
Thank you for those wonderful and thought-provoking presentations. Dr. Cooper basically demonstrating how entwined Nova Scotia, the Maritimes, and Canada were in the financial circuits of the transatlantic slave trade, part of the wealth that was generated and the inequalities that exist. Professor Henry Dixon on basically reclaiming the agencies of people who were enslaved in Canada. Your story about Chloe Cooley is very important because if she had not screamed and resisted, okay, when she was being transferred against Niagara, the people wouldn't have heard her screams, and this would not have become the catalyst for the 1793 Act. It reminds me, I was just in Yarmouth County, and there's the Tusket River where Jude, who was enslaved by Samuel Andrews and his sons, was brutally killed by them. And in Tusket River, there's still people still talk about her story because she resisted, and people can even say they can hear her screams at night. And so the agencies of the enslaved is important to recover. And lastly, Dr. Kotru Robbins, I think your presentation on archaeology, how it's necessary here. You can actually find the remnants of the existence of slavery here. The terrain and the landscape speak to us. They're also a subject matter, and the role of communities in shaping this discourse. Thank you all for these wonderful presentations. Unfortunately, and I know I spoke a bit at the end, we have no time for questions, but we do have time for lunch. And I'm sure that our esteemed panelists here, Dr. Cooper, Professor Henry Dixon, and Dr. Kotru Robbins will more than make themselves available to talk to you about these profound subject matter and how Canada, which likes to pretend it had a gentler, kindler colonialism, is part of this sordid, horrific history. Thank you.